Next topic we need to cover in this chapter is risk. To be more exactly, investment risk. Now, there are two types of investment risk. There's overall risk and there is portfolio risk. And portfolio risk, some people also call it market risk and systematic risk. So first, let's define the investment risk. Now, investment risk is the probability of the earning a low or negative actual return. And we say the greater the probability that the investment earn a lower than expected or negative rate of return, then we say that investment is more risky. Now, let's look at the overall risk. How do we define overall risk? In this numerical example, let's say we have 5 possible economic states. So next year the economy can be really good or can be really bad. Okay? And there's 5 possible outcomes in terms of the next year's economy. So the first scenario, economy can be in recession, and then we have the 10% probability that the economy will be in a recession. And then let's say we have 2 investments here, stock A and stock B. Stock A's return, if the economy is in a recession, is negative 30%. Stock B's return is 20% if economy is in the recession. Now, economy can also slow down next year, and there's a 20% chance that the economy will slow down next year. So in a situation that economy slows down, stock A's return is negative 10%, stock B's return is positive 10%. The third scenario, economy can be flat or average. And let's say there's a 40% chance the economy will stay flat. And then in a flat economy, stock A's return is 3%, stock B's return is 0%. Now, next year economy can also grow mildly. Okay, if it does that, there's a 20% chance it will grow mildly. And in the mild growing economy, stock A's return is 15%, stock B's return is negative 15%. Now, economy next year can also be booming, and there's a 10% chance that the economy can be booming. So in a booming economy, stock A's return is 40%, stock B's return is negative 25%. Now, when you look at the stock A's return, stock B's return, how those change with the economy, we can clearly see that stock A moves along with the economy, and stock B kind of moves against the economy. So when the economy is good, actually stock B's return is bad. When the economy is bad, then stock B's return is actually pretty good. So in reality, it's hard to find these type of companies. One possible type of business that moves against the economy is the repossession guys, right? So when the economy is bad, a lot of people file for bankruptcy or late for payments, then these repo guys will go out there and tow their cars, repossess their properties. So that could be an example of stock B, which moves against the economy. Now, based on the probability of these economic states and the stock return in these economic states, we can calculate the expected return of these stocks. Now, first, let's look at the expected return of stock A. So, in the recession, stock A's return is negative 30%, and there's 10% chance the economy could be in the recession, or 10% chance stock A's return is negative 30%. So to calculate the expected return of A, we need to multiply the possible outcome of stock A's return with the probability of that possible outcome. So the first possible outcome for stock A's return is negative 30%, and the probability is 10%. So multiply these together, we have negative 3%. And then you would do the same for all the possible outcome of stock A's return. So you will get negative 3%, negative 2% for slowdown economy, and 1.2% for flat economy, 3% for mild growing economy, and 4% for booming economy. So once you multiply the probability with the possible outcome, we call it weight the possible outcome by the probability, and then you sum these up, you get the expected return, which is the weighted average of the possible outcome. And the weight is the probability of the possible outcome. So the weighted average of the possible outcome for stock A is 3.2%. And that's the expected return of 3.2%. Now, why do we need to calculate the expected return of A? Well, suppose your grandma asks you to describe stock A. What will stock A do next year? And you will have to explain to the grandmother, these are the possible outcomes and these are the probability of the possible outcomes. And that'll be too much because the grandma wouldn't understand all that if she doesn't have a finance background. So how do you explain this stock A's next year's return to your grandmother? Well, if you can calculate the expected return, you can just say the expected return of the stock A next year is 3.2%. That 3.2% expected return incorporate both the possible outcome and the probability of those possible outcomes. Now, the expected return of stock B is calculated the same way. All the possible outcome of stock B's return multiplied by the probability of that possible outcome, and then you sum them up. That will give you the expected return of stock B. And in this case, it will be negative 1.5%. Now, let's look at how to calculate standard deviation. So, to calculate standard deviation, first, we need to calculate the expected return, which we just did on the previous slides. Now, after we calculate the expected return for these two stocks, we can calculate the standard deviation of these two stocks' rate of return. So let's use stock A standard deviation, for example, first. Early on, we see that economy has 5 possible states, and then there's 5 probability associated with these states. And then in each economic state, what is the stock A's return? So to calculate the standard deviation, first, we need to use the possible outcome and then subtract the expected return of stock A, which is calculated on the previous slides. So the first possible outcome in the recession, stock A's return is negative 30%. Now the expected return of stock A is 3.2%. So the first possible outcome, negative 30, minus the expected return, 3.2%. And then the difference is negative 33.2%. That's the fourth column of this table. And then after we calculate the difference between the possible outcome and the expected return, take the square term of this difference. So negative 33.2% square that will give us 0.110224. And then we need to multiply the square term by the probability of that possible outcome. So 10% is the probability times 0.110224. So that's 0.01010224. And then you do the same for all the different possible outcomes. So use the possible outcome, subtract the expected return, take the square term, and then multiply by the probability of that possible outcome. Once you calculate all these 5 possible outcomes and then sum them up, that will give us 0.0308504. And this is the variance of stock A's rate of return. And then we need to take the square root of this variance to get the standard deviation. So the square root of 0.0308504 is 0.1756428. So our standard deviation for stock A's rate of return is about 17.56%. Now, the standard deviation for stock B is calculated in the same way. So 5 different possible outcomes. Each possible outcome of stock B's return minus the expected return of B or the mean of B's return, which is negative 1.5%, and then take the square term and multiply the square term by the probability of that possible outcome. And once you do 5 of them, sum them up, that should give us the variance of stock B's return, which is 0.016525. And then take the square term of the variance, we get the standard deviation for stock B, which is 0.1285496. Now, let's discuss the investor's attitude toward risk. And first, let's define the concept of risk aversion. So what is risk aversion? Risk aversion does not mean people dislike risk and people don't want to take any risk at all. Risk aversion means if you want somebody to take a risk, and if this person is a rational investor, then you better give this person some compensation as the return for the risk. Otherwise, this rational investor will not take risk without any compensation. So that's what a risk aversion means, okay? And this risk aversion is based on the assumption that investors are rational. Now, another concept is risk premium. So what is risk premium? The difference between the return on the risky assets and the return of the risk-free assets. So if we look at risk-free assets like a treasury bill, it is risk-free. However, it also offers a rate of return. So for risky assets, how much more return does a risky asset offer? Well, that's what the risk premium term describes. So based on the risk that the risky assets has, how much more compensation is for that risk. So that's what the risk premium concept is. Now, a lot of the times people talk about portfolios. So what is a portfolio or investment portfolio? Well, let's look at what the portfolio does to your investment. So assume that we have these 2 stocks in our portfolio, stock A and stock B from the previous example. And let's say half of our money is on stock A and the other half of the money is on stock B. So 50% of the portfolio is stock A and 50% of the portfolio is stock B. Now we have 2 stocks, so we can say we have a portfolio. Okay, so now for the portfolio, if you want to look at the portfolio performance, you will have to look at the portfolio's expected return and the portfolio's risk instead of individual securities in the portfolio, right? So you can't just look at A's return, A's risk, or B's return, B's risk. You have to look at both of them together as a combination, as a portfolio. So in terms of the portfolio's risk and the expected return, what is the performance of that portfolio? Now, for a portfolio, the portfolio expected return is the weighted average of the individual securities in the portfolio. And the portfolio's risk, which is measured by the standard deviation, that is not the average of the individual securities standard deviation. The portfolio standard deviation is much lower than the weighted average of the portfolio standard deviation most of the time. And in the worst case, the portfolio standard deviation is the average of the individual securities standard deviation. Now, let's look at the expected return calculation of the portfolio. So, there are two ways we can calculate a portfolio's return. The easiest way, the portfolio expected return is just the weighted average of the individual securities